So I just wanted to have this little discussion today concerning the little mini consoles. You know, starting with the NES Classic came out in, what was it, 2016? It was a different time, man. Holy crap, it's been like freaking 7 years, dude. Time flies, like ridiculous. And then, what, a couple years after they re-released it, the Super Nintendo Mini came out. Over time, you had things like the PlayStation Classic, which really sucked balls when it first came out, but the hacking community really made that thing amazing. One of my favorites just because of the hacks. The PlayStation Classic's one of my favorites just because, you know, of like Auto Bleem and stuff like that. Then you had the TurboGrafx 16 Mini and the PC Engine Mini, Core Graphics Mini. Really dug those. If I had to choose one, like the Super Nintendo, it just has amazing games. The Super Nintendo Classic Edition has amazing games. It would probably be my number one pick if I had to pick one that was my favorite, non-hacked. Hacked would be the PlayStation Classic. I've talked about that before. But maybe second, almost tying for first, would be the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, simply because it has some freaking awesome games on it, and it's kind of like experiencing something for the first time almost. Like, I knew like one kid back in the day with a TurboGrafx 16, and he had like Bonks and like a couple other games. That was it. We barely ever got to play it. It was a greedy mofo, but you'd go over there, play every once in a while. But that was the only exposure I really had till later in life. Started emulating everything in its mother and just playing all these games. But recently, just yesterday, and I've been wanting to talk about this, I saw a news article floating around from a Video Games Chronicle and a few other places where they're talking about a Sega Saturn Mini. And I remember after the Genesis Mini 2 came out that Sega in Japan, they didn't do it over here, but they did like a poll or like a little questionnaire to customers and whatnot, asking about future minis. And one, you know, they talked about Sega Saturn Mini, Dreamcast Mini, and my thought was like, you know, they could have done a Master System Mini. That would have been kind of interesting. I didn't have a ton of exposure to that, but I know in certain countries it was huge. In the US, not so much. There were still people who had it, but I thought that would be kind of neat. But going forward, I mean, they could have started with that first. Like, you know, Nintendo started with the NES and then moved to the Super Nintendo. They could have started with the Master System and then the Genesis. You know, they did the Genesis and the Genesis 2, and it's kind of like, man, you know, putting out new models. Are they going to do the little Genesis Model 3? So people are thinking, man, a Saturn or a Dreamcast Mini could be likely, but now they're saying the president of Sega, or the COO, Sega president and the COO, is saying that the Saturn is proving difficult to adapt into a miniature console. And I think there's a few reasons for that. And the main one is cost. Sega Saturn was a complicated system that was one of the later systems to, you know, have emulation kind of evolve, you know, into a playable state. Like everything else was like working fine before Saturn. It just took a long time. I think the architecture of the system and whatnot. So now it's like, yeah, on a Raspberry Pi 4, certain Android boxes, you could play Sega Saturn, but it's kind of limited. You know what I mean? So for something on a cheap single board computer, how are they going to be able to release something at a reasonable price and put Sega Saturn on it? So my thought was like, well, maybe they'll dip into the Dreamcast instead and maybe go back to the Saturn at a later date, because it seems like, you know, with them working with Zwicky on mini consoles, the arcade machines, Astro City Mini, stuff like that, you know, the Zwicky's got their hands full with things, but they've worked on tons of this stuff. I was like, a Dreamcast is more likely. You could play the vast majority of the Dreamcast library on a cheap-ass single-board computer decently well. Just you have to have the proper, you know, engineers behind it to kind of optimize everything. You know, a select set of games, just make sure everything runs perfect. And I think with the Saturn, that definitely would be a little more difficult to do. Might get a couple, you know, Sega-owned games running okay, but then, you know, trying to get a whole collection of stuff on there, it'd be a difficult task at this time to keep it reasonably priced anyway. Then I was also thinking, you know what, I'm a sucker for this kind of stuff. I ain't gonna lie. I love these mini classic edition consoles. The Super Nintendo, the NES, it was kind of a weird time where I think it was a bigger thing at that time. Like you could go in the store and buy them. Maybe, not really. I had my whole story with that, how much of a hassle it was trying to get these things. I think a lot of people had a hassle trying to get these things. Scalpers all over the place, all over your face, scooping them up. But it was a different time in the sense that Nintendo was launching the Nintendo Switch. And there was already this like sour taste in people's mouths from the Wii U. And it was, to me, was like this big ploy. Like, let's get these classic things out there. You know, people can argue all day the artificial scarcity and stuff like that with the Amiibos, with the NES Classic, Super Nintendo Classic, that they manufactured that, the scarcity to get people talking, to get people hyped, people going out there, you know, getting Nintendo's name spoken about heavily. And I think it worked. It worked. And for sure it worked. It worked in the sense that people were like, holy crap, we got to try to get this thing. Nintendo's planning to put the Nintendo Switch out. Is it going to be the same thing? Is it going to be crazy difficult to get? We got to get it. We got to run out and find this thing. So it got Nintendo fresh in people's minds again. And we're like, holy crap, these things are cool. They got this new system coming out. I don't want to be left behind. Have that fear of missing out. Let me get a Switch as well. Because you know it's going to be hard to get. I'm not saying the NES Super Nintendo Classic is directly attributed to the success of the Switch. But I think that initial getting the steam going is for sure attributed to those tactics and the way Nintendo did stuff. It was a completely different time than what it is now. Completely different. Nintendo, I haven't really seen them use those same kind of tactics, but back to Sega, right? Dreamcast, Saturn Mini, the climate that we're in, and looking at how Sega released their last mini console to the world, I just really think this kind of stuff is on the back burner. They said they'll visit it when the time is right. But remember, the Mega Drive Mini 2, Sega Genesis Mini 2, you could only get it through Amazon Japan. If you were in the US and it was listed on the Amazon US website, it was a global listing. It was being handled by Amazon Japan. Would they do that again if they put out a Dreamcast or Saturn Mini? Would it only be through Japan if you wanted to get your hands on it? And Sega kind of used those tactics too with the Genesis Mini 2. If you recall, I reported on it where they're like, man, we produced so many less this time. You could still go on there and order one. They were trying to get that fear of missing out, get those numbers pumped up, people buying them. I don't know the numbers behind these systems, but I don't think the Genesis Mini 2 did as well as the first one or any previous mini consoles. I almost, like, I would be down, like, if Nintendo put out Nintendo 64 Mini, if Sega put out a Saturn or Dreamcast Mini, like, that's it. Beyond that, I don't really care anymore. Unless years later, maybe a GameCube Mini, a Wii Mini, I don't know, man. PlayStation 2 Mini. I just don't see that kind of stuff happening, not anytime soon. But I'm a sucker for this stuff, but I just don't think the mass market appeal is quite there anymore. I mean, it's easy enough to emulate most of this stuff. I just really want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts concerning a Dreamcast, Saturn Mini? Are you still hyped up for this stuff? Is it just this little niche community now who buys this stuff, like me, maybe some of the people who watch my channel, and it's just not as big of a thing as it once was? Curious to hear what you guys got to say. I read all the comments. Thanks for watching. Just kind of a rant and ramble. Bye.